Alright guys, so I got another Rippaverse video here for you today, because we're going to be talking about The Great War of Separation, number 1. So this is a book that I've actually had in my possession for a while now, but I'm just now getting a chance to read it and cover it. So this is another new release from Rippaverse Comics, and this is the first entry in a miniseries that is obviously going to be about the Great War of Separation, which is a pivotal event in this universe. So this is cover A, which is the Kane & White cover. I always love the Kane & White covers for these books. Though I did go back and forth on which cover to get, because cover D for this book was actually fantastic as well. But that was the mass print cover, and this one was limited, so I decided to go ahead and get this one now, and of course I could always get the other one later if I wanted. I might end up using cover D for my thumbnail, though. But yeah, all the covers are great. So this is another book written by Chuck Dixon, which if you've been following the Rippaverse, you know that he's written several titles in this universe. He did Alpha Core, and he did The Horseman, and now he's doing this as well. So it's written by Chuck Dixon, with art by Jack Herbert, and colors by Candace Hahn. So new artist for this one. Now this book is shorter than the other Rippaverse releases that we have gotten so far, which this book is about 56 pages, which most of their titles are around, the 90-something page range. So a bit on the shorter side, but it was also cheaper. This book was $18, which again, if you get the mass print cover, I think it was a few dollars cheaper. But it seems like this is going to be the standard for Rippaverse going forward, at least for most of their titles, closer to the 50-something page range, which personally I'm okay with if it means that we're going to be getting more frequent releases, which if this year is anything to go by, we definitely are. So it's a little bit different from the format that we're used to, but it's something that I can definitely get behind if it means a faster paced release schedule. So as always, before we dive into spoiler territory, I will just give some general thoughts on this book, which obviously, like I said, it does cover the Great War of Separation, which is the war that resulted in Texas breaking away from the rest of the United States. So this book is something that a lot of people, I think, have been waiting for in the Rippaverse, which is basically just a giant origin story, since this book is an absolute lore goldmine. It goes into a lot of the history of the world. The very first page in this book actually is a map of North America, so we finally get a full glimpse of what the continent looks like in this universe, which is actually a shocking twist right off the bat when you see that. But this entire thing is basically told from the perspective of a flashback that's being narrated by Brian Solari, who we know as the leader of the Alpha Corps now, and, from the other books we've heard talk of him being a hero in this war. So we're getting him sort of narrating what happened here, and it does at least start the story of how that war began, and gets into the details of that. Now, of course, this is just number 1 in a series, so it does, stop short of giving us everything, since obviously this is going to continue going in future issues. And like I said, the shorter page format does leave you wanting a little bit. I will go ahead and say that this book does end on a cliffhanger, but it does give you a good chunk of info to sink your teeth into, and it does give some nice lore and backstory for not only the world itself, but also Brian as a character, and also the Silman family, which of course we know Avery Silman, the sort of flagship character in this universe, ISOM. We get to see Avery and Altona when they were still children, and how the war affected them and their family. So we get a good taste of all of that, which a lot of the stuff in this book does open up a lot of new questions. For every one we get answered, we'll probably get 2 or 3 more new ones. So there is a lot of intrigue and a lot of interesting things to get into in this book, and it does set up a lot of compelling things to go into in the future issues in this series as well, which, at least right now, we don't know exactly how many issues the series is going to be going for, Obviously, it's not going to go on forever since it's just covering a specific event, but they've got enough here to go for at least several issues, I think. So overall, I will say that the story is very interesting. It is very compelling. It introduces several new characters, all of which I found pretty interesting, several which very likable. And of course, like I said, it does dive in more into the backstory of some characters we're already familiar with. So if you're someone who's been following the Rippaverse so far and you've been intrigued by the little nuggets of world building that we've gotten in the various books, and you've been waiting for something to really flesh that out in a lot more detail, this is absolutely the book for you. If you're someone that has never read a Rippaverse book before, you can go ahead and pick this up and start with this if you wanted to, and you wouldn't be like totally lost or anything. You may miss out on a few little details here, if you're not familiar with some of the characters, but for the most part, you can start fresh with this book and fully enjoy it for what it is. So yeah, overall, really nice book. So with all that being said, I am going to dive into spoiler territory now, so if you haven't read this and you don't want to know anything that happens, you have of course been warned. So diving right in, like I said, on the first page we do immediately get a map of North America, and we also immediately get the first big twist of this book, because we come to find out that the Great War of Separation isn't just Texas breaking away from the United States as we know it. Actually, before this war even began, the United States had already split up into 4 smaller countries. So we get a look at this map that shows us that Florida, Georgia, and Alabama have become their own country known as Greater Florida, while the state I'm in, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and a lot of the Midwest, has become the Mid-Southern Alliance. Meanwhile, all the territory from the Rocky Mountains east has become Bromhouse, while the entire New England area, all the way down into the Carolinas, as well as, some of the more northern states like your Wisconsins and your Minnesotas, all of that area is still the United States, as well as Texas and Oklahoma. So the United States is actually split up into 2 non-conjoined areas, and is actually split apart by 2 other countries now, with Alaska and Hawaii seemingly being their own countries now too, I guess. They seem separate from everything else. So this is labeled as the pre-war map, so this is how things look before the Great War of Separation takes place. So that means there's a lot more lore for us to get into in the future, since we obviously have to learn about how all this happened at some point. But for right now, we are just going to be focusing on how Texas ends up breaking away, which is of course still part of the United States at the beginning of this book. So after getting a look at that map, we do cut to a scene at a school, where we see a young Avery Silman, who we now know as Isom, in school studying geography, and they're talking about this very map that we just took a look at. So then things shift to the next scene, where this is where the flashback begins, and we have a narration that we come to later find out is Brian Solari talking about all this, and we sort of see the flashpoint that sort of began the entire war. So we see the scene of some Texas military border patrol agents going around and stopping some people from illegally crossing the border. So during this encounter, one of the guys that they capture ends up having a bomb strapped to his chest. So this bomb ends up detonating and killing a bunch of the soldiers here. So meanwhile, while all this is going on nearby, there are 2 helicopters that are also patrolling the border, and they find another group of cartel members, some drug mules, crossing the border as well. So they attempt to stop them, and one of the helicopters is actually shot down by a cartel member. So the remaining helicopter ends up opening fire on these cartel guys and kills a lot of them, even though they were still technically on the Mexico side of the border. So the 2 pilots of that helicopter, who we come to find out are named Captain John Hernandez and Lieutenant Trevor Lyle. When they return to base, they immediately end up getting arrested since they opened fire on, a foreign country. And this entire event ends up blowing up into a massive scandal, with the U.S. government being really upset with them, causing this international incident and, murdering, Mexican citizens, even though they're, of course, cartel members. So this entire thing ends up becoming a huge scandal, with the entire population pretty much picking a side and either saying that, what these pilots did was a horrible, act of war and a terrible thing and an assault on human rights and, all this awful stuff. Or on the other side, you had a lot of people siding with them, saying they did the right thing because, their fellow soldiers just got shot out of the sky and they had to retaliate. So the entire population ends up becoming split over this issue. And at this point, we do get a look at a young Brian Solari, who is still in the U.S. Army at this point as a general. We see him watching all this sort of unfold on TV. We also get another look at the Silman family. So again, we see a young Avery, and we get a look at his parents, Jacob and Harriet, with Jacob clearly siding with the Texas soldiers in this altercation, and thinking that he might end up getting called up at some point to deal with this, since, he's a former guardsman. So next we get a look at how the cartel is responding to this. So we meet a new character named El Caiman, who is basically the guy in charge of the Soyuz cartel, which were, some of the guys that got shot in this whole altercation. Which apparently one of the ones who died was El Caiman's son. So he's super pissed about this whole thing, and he wants revenge. So he ends up sending some of his guys with a truck full of explosives to a border checkpoint, and he sets it off and kills a bunch of people, and he opens fire on the first responders and everything. So it's like this massive, bloody backlash to what happened to the cartel guys. So this entire thing only escalates the entire situation further, at which point we meet Governor McClune, who is the governor of Texas, and he's sort of incompetent, and he's given a speech about how he spoke to the president, and the president is going to make sure that everything is dealt with, and basically he's not taking any action himself, which is causing a pretty negative reaction from the Texas population, since they want him to do something about this whole thing. So McClune ends up going and talking to his lieutenant governor, Plessy Sanders, who is encouraging him to take some kind of action, since that's what the people expect of him. And he actually ends up talking McClune into pardoning the 2 helicopter pilots that started this whole thing. So the public seems to react pretty well to that, but of course that just pisses off the cartel members more. So then things end up getting escalated even further, when 3 Air Force members sort of go rogue and go out on an unofficial mission, and they fly into Mexican airspace, and they find the hideout where a lot of these cartel guys are staying, and they end up bombing the ever-loving shit out of it. So they end up killing a bunch of the cartel members, including El Caiman. So they deal a massive blow to the cartel and take out their leader, but he is immediately replaced by his brother, who is named El Oso, which is apparently Spanish for the bear. So this guy's in prison, and he's an even tougher guy than his brother was, apparently. So he's incredibly dangerous and incredibly violent. So he ends up getting a hold of one of his fellow inmates who's going to be released soon, and he threatens that guy's family in order to send him on a mission when he gets out to kill Governor McClune. So this guy ends up going out and doing exactly that. He pulls a gun on the governor at a press conference and shoots him dead. So with Governor McClune dead, Plessy Sanders ends up becoming the new governor of Texas. And at which point he immediately wastes no time in taking the action that McClune did not want to take. So he ends up fortifying the border and building a big beautiful border wall, as well as stopping all of the crossings, both legal and illegal, so he completely shuts down the border between Texas and Mexico. He also calls all the guardsmen into active duty, including Jacob Silman, Avery's father. So he ends up getting called to action. So Governor Sanders doing all this stuff has obviously pissed off the U.S. president, since he doesn't approve of a governor taking actions like this against a foreign nation. So we get a scene of a phone conversation between them where the president is threatening to cut off all federal funding to Texas, and he actually ends up also threatening to send the troops in and arrest Sanders and drag him to D.C. So Sanders obviously doesn't respond very well to this, and he ends up basically telling the president to fuck off. And he says that he's not worried about losing out on the funding since Texas has such a large economy of its own. And basically he's refusing to bend the knee to what the federal government wants. So Texas is standing up for its own sovereignty in this situation. So he immediately has the Texas guardmen seize all of the U.S. military bases that are in the state, and anyone who is there who actually is from Texas, they end up offering them the opportunity to join the Texas Army while shipping everyone else back to the U.S. Sanders also orders an evacuation for the entire capital since he's worried that, there might be some kind of attack to go after him. So he evacuates all the citizens, so that means the Silman family does have to leave Austin and travel to Flores Park to stay with Avery's aunt. So at this point, Texas has effectively seceded from the Union, and they even got a new flag that is similar to the old Texas flag, but it does have a pair of crossed guns on it. That looks pretty cool. So we then cut to a scene at the Pentagon, where a bunch of high-level generals are talking to Brian Solari, and they are asking him to lead a task force in order to take back Texas. So they basically want to invade and take down Sanders and regain control of the entire situation, since they mentioned they don't want another Bromhouse seceding situation. So apparently the Bromhouse territory had something similar happen here. But yeah, they're trying to task Brian with leading this invasion of Texas, and Brian does not like this idea in the least. So he ends up taking off his stars and throwing them on their desk and resigning from his position. So Brian Solari ends up leaving the U.S. military entirely, refusing to fight against his home state. A sort of General Lee-esque move. So then we get another scene of El Oso, who is still in prison, but he's getting a report from his fellow cartel guys, where he's talking about the money's drying up since the border's been shut down, and they're discussing whether they should do about the entire situation. So El Oso ends up telling them to send in someone named Zeno, which elicits a shocked reaction from his fellow cartel members. So he's pulling out the big guns. So then we get a brief scene of Brian returning to Texas and talking with, some of the soldiers guarding the border and telling them that he's just trying to get home and asks if they can get the governor on the phone. So this is obviously the beginning of Brian joining up with the Texas Army as opposed to the U.S. Army. So it then jumps to a scene of some time later where we see some Texas soldiers out on patrol somewhere, I suppose. And we get a look at who we learn is Zeno. So this guy just randomly comes wandering up to them, and he mentions that he has some business to handle in Texas. So they end up realizing that this guy is an except. So they try to blow him away, but when they shoot him, his body basically liquefies, and the bullets have no effect on him. So he ends up taking down all these soldier guys, and he attacks one of them and shape-shifts into the guy with his uniform. So we learn that Zeno is a shape-shifting except that is working for the cartel, and he has now disguised himself as one of the Texas soldiers so he can sneak across the border and potentially go after Governor Sanders. So then the last scene we get is a sort of brief rundown of some of the skirmishes and things that are happening as the war rages on. And then we get a scene of the president talking with some of his generals, talking about what they should do next and how they should get this taken care of as soon as possible, and how they can't just go in guns blazing because they don't want the public to see this as a war on their fellow citizens. So they're talking about how they should handle things, and one of them ends up suggesting that they should deploy Project Resolute Fist. So we see one of the generals go and he meets with a group of excepts that they have in holding somewhere. So we meet a whole group of these excepts, including a very huge, jacked up guy named Stallion, who sort of looks a little bit like Sylvester Stallone in the face, at least. At least that's the first thing I thought of. So anyway, the general is talking to this group of excepts, and talking about how he's got a week to turn them into a unit of super creeps. So basically, the U.S. Army is creating its own Special Forces unit of Exceps to try to get Texas back in line. And it ends on that cliffhanger. So overall, like I said, I did really enjoy the story in this book. I thought it was really interesting that, we learned that the United States was already split into pieces before this war even began. And Texas seceding is just another piece being broken off. I definitely didn't expect that to be the outcome. I thought this was sort of like the beginning of the U.S. splitting apart. So that opens up a ton of new questions for us about the entire history of all these other countries breaking apart and how that came to be. So that's a lot of cool stuff we can definitely explore in the future. As far as the plot of this book and, the beginnings of the war itself, I did think it was very interesting the way things are playing out, how the cartel is involved, how there's exceps on all three sides, and, how that sets up some interesting conflicts for future battles. As for the new characters that they introduced in this book, I did like all of them. Zeno being a shapeshifter is obviously a very interesting thing that has a lot of story potential in the future. I definitely liked Governor Plessy Sanders. He was probably my favorite of the new characters that they introduced in this. I just liked his whole personality and the way he just kind of rolled in and took charge and took no shit off of anybody. So I really appreciated that. I really liked the stuff with the Silman family, getting to see a little bit of their parents. Now, obviously, we didn't get much of that in this book. I expect to get more in the future issues. But obviously, Avery's father, Jacob, is now being drafted into this war, essentially. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of role he ends up playing. It'll be interesting to see if the events of this war somehow results in Avery getting his powers, since we still don't know, the origins of his abilities as well. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. We don't know, actually, at this point, if Brian has his powers yet or not either. Nothing in this book gave any indication that, he had his abilities yet. So there might be some future events in this series that is him, becoming an Except as well. So I definitely like a lot of the stuff they set up for future issues in this series. Now, like I said, since this book was just 56 pages and does have that shorter format, it did feel a little bit less like a complete story that we're used to getting from some of the other Rippaverse books. Now, obviously, this is number 1 in the series, and this story is going to continue pretty soon, actually, in the Great War of Separation number 2, which I actually already have pre-ordered. So, it's not a huge deal, but it does, feel more like a piece of a whole as opposed to a self-contained story like some of the other books are. So, a little bit different in that regard. But again, it does set up a lot of very compelling things for us to go into in future issues. And I am absolutely looking forward to see where they take this and finding out even more about this world and the backstory of all these characters and everything. But yeah, I definitely recommend this book overall if you are interested in this universe, even in the slightest bit. This is one that definitely introduces you to a lot of things and sort of sets up a lot of good, interesting stories for the future. So anyway, in addition to this book, I do also have Yaira number 2 and Ripazine number 3 in my possession as well. And hopefully I'll be able to read those soon and get a video up on those. I'll probably do those in one video since, of course, the Ripazines aren't very long. So that should be the next Rippaverse related video I'll be doing. And of course I have several more Rippaverse books already pre-ordered. So I haven't got them yet because I pre-ordered them together to save on shipping. But yeah, whenever I get my hands on those, I'll definitely be covering the next releases as well. So anyway, I guess that's all I got to say. So lots of luck to you and yours.